the only decision I ever knew how to make. I did what I thought was right.
50 years ago, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. To this day, Americans know very little about how that decision was reached.
It's been justified ever since as something that saved American lives. The ambiguity is something we're really not prepared for.
Tonight, a week before the bomb's anniversary, why it was dropped. Did it shorten the war? Did it save American lives? Was it necessary? Were there alternatives? Did the United States need to be the first and only nation to use an atomic bomb? This was a war fought against evil, against military dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and Japan. This was a war the United States did not seek, but after Pearl Harbor, fought with a unity of purpose it has not experienced since. When Harry Truman became president, Germany was close to surrender, but the war in the Pacific was still to be won. Against an enemy Americans had come to hate even more than the Germans.
The Japanese behavior is appalling and atrocious toward Chinese, toward civilians, toward peoples throughout Asia, toward prisoners of war. It's very clear that in Germany there were good Germans and bad Germans, and almost always the Americans describe themselves as fighting Hitler or Nazis. In the case of the Japanese, you get all sorts of slogans like the only good Jap is a dead Jap.
Japan was clearly near defeat. The question is, was Japan near surrender?
Surrender was the question. It would turn on the U.S. demand that surrender be total. Total with no conditions. And the Japanese fear that the imperial throne would not be allowed to survive.
The emperor to them was like a god, and they worshipped him. So, in a sense, he personified their nation. And until he gave a signal that it was all right to surrender, they were ready to fight to the death.
Japan's own policy, led by the military forces and supported by the Emperor of Japan, was to show the Americans how terribly costly it would be if they tried to push the war to an invasion or to unconditional surrender. The last year of the war was the killing year, and neither side can seem to break out of this before a final cataclysmic end.
In this killing year, Japan's suicide pilots were promised glory in death, sent off in aircraft laden with bombs and only enough fuel for a one-way trip. A 19-year-old pilot would write this on the eve of a mission.
To bring the nation to victory was our thought. And what was that nation? The land of my parents, younger brothers, and sister. Can we bear seeing our country invaded by outside enemies? That was on my mind. We were innocents.
The Japanese kamikaze missions would strike a chord of terror in the American psyche and convince American troops that the enemy would fight to the bitter end. That summer, America was watching too many of its young men die.
The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The Chiefs of Staff had to make the plan for the invasion of Japan without considering the atomic bomb. It was estimated that to land on Kyushu and conquer it would cost 250,000 of our youngsters to be killed and 500,000 of them to be maimed for life.
The projected casualty numbers that President Truman would use later in life would range from 250,000 to 1 million. That notion of putting 1 million lives at risk long ago became a central part of the argument for using the bomb, though the figure of 1 million has never been found in any of the briefings President Truman received from his military commanders. The real debate in the summer of 1945 was not whether an invasion would be a tragedy. It would have been. But there was no plan to invade for another several months. The real question was how to end the war without that bloody fight to the finish. There was a military option. There was a diplomatic one. And there was the bomb. The military option was to wait for the Russians to get into the war. In a secret agreement, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had promised Roosevelt that 3 months after the end of the European campaign, his Red Army would move against the Japanese occupying China. As early as April, U.S. military intelligence concluded that a Russian invasion could be decisive. "75,000 Japanese had died on Okinawa. 13,000 Americans had been killed. As the Japanese war widows were presented with the ashes of their husbands, in Washington there were some people looking for a political way to end the war.
Under terms and conditions to be agreed, the Japanese could keep the emperor.
That was the political option. Let the Japanese keep their emperor. And President Truman knew that everyone in the bitterly divided Japanese government would insist on it.
Policymakers who were advising Truman, those who were closest to Truman and for whom he had a great deal of respect, were saying, look, Mr. President, one way we can end the war as rapidly as possible is to modify our demand for unconditional surrender.
Our intelligence people, to a man, said, look, if you harm the god, they will fight forever. You must tell them that you're not going to do that. Say that he can be like the King of England. We won't harm him, he won't have any power, but in some way make it very clear that that will not be the case, that he will not be harmed.
There were alternatives, and Truman and Stimson and Burns and the others were fully conscious of those alternatives. One was to wait for the Soviets to come into the war. One was to modify unconditional surrender. Another alternative was to use the atomic bomb.
The secret development of a terrible weapon during a war fought for total victory had created a powerful impulse to use it. Only the scientists seemed to understand it would change the world forever. On the eve of its success, some of them felt increasingly trapped between their ominous invention and the political leaders who would determine its use.
They wanted to, if you will, play fair with the Japanese and warn them, not kill civilians, if the weapon itself would scare them into surrender. I think more importantly, they wanted to keep from surprising the Russians.
They felt that the more of a surprise it was, the more damage it did, the more awesome the weapon appeared to be, the more likely it was to lead to a nuclear arms race. It would, by the nature of its effectiveness, drive the Soviets to get it as quickly as possible.
And they sat down with Burns to try to tell him about the need to have international control of this weapon, to tell the Russians ahead of time so they're not surprised, not scared. And he was talking to just the wrong man. Burns had seen the advances the Russians were making in Europe, and he wanted to impress the Russians with Americans' firmness and with the fact that this was going to be a shared peace. And so to him, the bomb was just the thing he was waiting for.
I was completely flabbergasted at the assumption that rattling the bomb might make Russia more manageable. I was concerned at this point that by demonstrating the bomb and using it in the war against Japan, we might start an atomic arms race between America and Russia, which might end with the destruction of both countries.
President Truman never saw their petition. The idea of demonstrating the bomb was vetoed. The idea of warning the Japanese was dismissed. In July of 1945, the president could still have said no. He could have done so during the Allied meeting in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, where he would first meet both Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Truman privately compared Stalin to the boss of the Missouri political machine from which he had come, and nicknamed him Uncle Joe. Stalin privately called Truman that noisy little shopkeeper. The Allied leaders knew they had to deal with one another in the world after the war. Truman had postponed their meeting until he was pretty sure he had the bomb. At Potsdam, the president writes in his diary about his first meeting with Stalin.
We had lunch, talked socially, put on a real show drinking toast to everyone, then pictures made in the backyard. I can deal with Stalin. He is honest, but smart as hell. Most of the big points are settled. He'll be in the Jap War on August 15th. Finny Japs when that comes about.
At this moment in Potsdam, before the bomb is a reality, the president seems to understand that he does have an important alternative to an American invasion of Japan. The Red Army's entry into the war might be the way to end it. He rejoices about the Russians in a letter to his wife.
I've gotten what I came for. Stalin goes to war August 15th with no strings on it. I'll say that we'll end the war a year sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed. That is the important thing.
I think the moral ambiguities in the use of the bomb come down to the question of when we used it and when we needed it to save casualties. Why we used 2 bombs in August to prepare for an invasion in November, when they were the only 2 bombs we had. We assumed there'd be a 3rd one in 2 weeks and a 4th one 2 weeks after that, but we weren't really sure. And the fact that we used those 2 in such a hurry, I think, speaks to Burns's concerns about the Russians rather than Truman's concerns about the casualties.
If proof were needed that the bomb had a momentum of its own, consider that even before the successful test of the plutonium bomb, the smaller uranium bomb, Little Boy, which scientists were certain would work without a test, had already left Los Alamos. President Truman would later claim that he gave the order to drop the atomic bomb only after the Japanese rejected his Potsdam warning. The truth is that the order to drop the bomb was cabled from Potsdam the day before, and the president did not sign it. August the 6th, 1945, 8:15 a.m.
There was an extraordinary flash, an eye-crushing flash. Then came the tremendous roar.
He met hundreds and hundreds who were fleeing, and every one of them seemed to be hurt in some way. The eyebrows of some were burned off, and skin hung from their faces and hands. Some were vomiting as they walked. Many were naked or in shreds of clothing. Many, although injured themselves, supported relatives who were worse off. Almost all had their heads bowed, looked straight ahead, were silent, and showed no expression whatever.
Hersey's words drew pictures of the bomb's victims that Americans still could not see. Films and photographs had been confiscated by the U.S. occupation forces. Images like these were censored then, and they were among the first to be removed from the Smithsonian this year, when its planned anniversary exhibit came under attack.